I want to thank you all for coming back. It's been a full schedule, and I also want to thank you all for electing an amazing steering committee. We had our second meeting last night, and it's a wonderful group, representative of this larger body, and I'm just so looking forward to working with the steering committee and your regional representatives over the next 2 years. I have the amazing honor this morning to introduce a friend. I first met Will Davis through my association with the National Capital Area chapter of UNA, because he was on our advisory council and still is. And he also at that time was running UNIC, the UN Information Center in Washington, D.C. And 2 years ago,
Yes.
went over to run the Washington office of United Nations Development Program. So he's currently the director of UNDP's Washington office, which acts as the liaison with the U.S. government, including U.S. Congress, think tanks, groups like us, NGOs, media, academic, diplomatic, and business communities, and he informs them about the role of UNDP, as he's going to discuss with us this morning. So this is part of his job. And we are so honored that he's able to take some time to be with us this morning. Before that, he worked on Capitol Hill, so he understands that part of how policy is made, as well as he understands UNA. He has been part of us for a while through our advisory council in the National Capital Area. So it's a great honor for me to have been asked to introduce Will. He's a good friend of UNA, and I was talking with somebody this morning and said, that's why we call him Will Davis, not Won't Davis. So.
Thank you very much, Karen. Thank you, Karen, and thank you, Chris. And first of all, and far most importantly, thank you, UNA. We in the United Nations could not do what we do without what you do, generating support for the United Nations throughout the United States, improving understanding of the work of the United Nations. No small task. It keeps me gainfully employed throughout the United States. So without you, we literally could not do the life-saving work that we do on a daily basis in every corner of the planet. You know, I've unfortunately had to curtail some of my road trips over the last couple years since joining UNDP, but when I was with UNIC Washington, my least favorite acronym in the UN system, UNIC Washington. Unique UNIC. I did get out I visit a lot of you. How many of you have heard me speak before out at your chapters? Well, okay, maybe I can get away with recycling a little of my old material, but I'll try to take it easy on you. For those of you that have heard me before, you've got my permission to turn off and tune out and get a nice little 45 minutes worth of sleep. But what I'm going to talk to you about today is advocating for peaceful progress. This is what Chris has asked me to comment upon for the next few minutes, and then with your permission, maybe I can take a little bit of time for Q&A at the end as well, in case you're interested in anything that I touch upon or anything that I leave out. So Chris has asked me to talk about advocating for peaceful progress, and I understand tomorrow is your big day, right? You're up on Capitol Hill. So when you get up there, you need to punch, you need to kick, you need to bite, you need to insult, you need to grab them by the neck and wring their scrawny necks until they submit to the importance of the United Nations and all the work that we do. That's not very peaceful. I don't think that's really the best approach. And for the record, in case YouTube is out there, I am joking. I've tried the neck wringing and it doesn't work. So what I want to do today is try to talk to you for a few minutes about approaches that I think resonate with our leaders up on Capitol Hill and the very important staff that you're going to spend time with tomorrow. We were talking outside for just a few minutes beforehand. I know folks come into town and they think, boy, if I don't get in to see my senator, it's a waste of time. These congressional staffers have got more power in their pinky when they hit that word processor to get the right number of zeros up there behind a number in an appropriations bill than you could possibly imagine. So that 25-year-old staffer that you're encountering tomorrow who's on their BlackBerry like this while you're talking in their little cubicle, treat them with respect, treat them with patience, try to get them to understand the work of the United Nations better, because these can be incredibly important allies. All right, it's a good time for you to be heading up to Capitol Hill. It's an extremely important time. Over the next year or year and a half, you're going to see a lot of important things coming out of the United Nations. Important for the UN, important for the planet, important for everyone on it. I'll touch on just a couple of them and then drill a little bit deeper into the post-2015 development agenda. We've got great names for stuff at the UN. But let's take a second to look at UN peacekeeping. It's not my bailiwick anymore, but my goodness. UN peacekeeping has now got more than 100,000 peacekeepers deployed in, I think the last count was 16 missions around the world, plus a special political mission in Afghanistan that is remarkably important. Of those more than 100,000, over 100 of them gave their lives in the service of their peacekeeping mission over the course of 2013. This is risky business. It's not something to be taken lightly. And in fact, last month was UN Peacekeeping Day, and I know UN Association, UN Foundation has done a lot of work trying to make sure people appreciate the good efforts of our colleagues that are out there in the field, literally putting their lives at risk in countries where they can't even communicate more often than not, trying to bring a little bit of peace and stability to regions of the world that have known nothing but conflict, strife, or war. On the humanitarian front, the United Nations is the only entity with the capability to marshal the resources of the international community, whether it be our colleagues at the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, UNICEF, the World Food Program, my own UN development program working in fragile states to help them move from conflict to longer-term development. The UN is the entity that marshals the resources of the world to bring relief to people in need, whether it be the people within Syria or the refugees that have fled Syria and now placing such a crushing burden on their neighbors in Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, and Iraq, whether it be responding to the recent Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines. It's the United Nations that is uniquely equipped, not perfect, but has learned valuable lessons over the course of the years to bring life-saving assistance to people without homes, without enough to eat, without a place to send their kids for schooling. And now on to post-2015. So peacekeeping, very important time. Lots of resources required from the US and other countries. Humanitarian, with the UN being called upon to do more and more. Again, the demands upon resources are ever increasing. And now the highly touted, much promised post-2015 development agenda. You know, I also have to thank UNA for the remarkable series of consultations that took place already across the United States. How many are folks from chapters that held the consultations? Wow! Good job. Good job. There was one point during the consultation process that UNDP was running that I think we had more people from Nigeria weighing in on the World We Want website than we had from the United States. We want to make sure Americans understand what's at stake, what it is that we have to grapple with, the opportunity that we have to seize over the next 18 months. Without your consultations, I don't think this process would have been kickstarted. And I'm going to call upon you to keep up that work, to reach out to your members and to interested members of your community and to non-interested members This really is going to be a big deal, not only for the UN, but for all of the people on the planet. We've got a chance to make them think more broadly, because as the Millennium Development Goals, you've all heard of the Millennium Development Goals right now. It's not MGD, Miller Genuine Draft. It's MDG, Millennium Development Goals. We've only had 14 years to work on that, but we're starting to penetrate. Now we're going to change it, now that we got some brand recognition. But it's remarkable, when I was in Ethiopia a couple years ago with UNDP, women in villages in western Ethiopia know about the MDGs. They're holding their local leaders responsible to making best efforts to meet these goals. And we're not done with them yet. We need to finish strong over the remaining time for the Millennium Development Goals so that we can make as much progress on those 8 important areas as possible. But now is also the time to come together and see what worked for the MDGs, what didn't work, and what might succeed them. It's an important opportunity. I've heard a couple of Chris's and Karen's colleagues in the UNA, UNF circles say that it's an important priority to make this next set of goals, assuming we get them, and by no means is this a done deal. It's going to be a nasty, contentious, difficult negotiating process. But assuming we do get a following success set of goals, it's important to make them, as I've heard others say, attainable, yet aspirational. The MDGs were wonderful. They were discrete, they were time-bound, they were targeted, you could get your hands around them, you could measure them. But I think a lot of people are also recognizing they've had their limits. We're just not getting to the people in fragile states or in countries that are riven by conflict. We're just not getting to populations that are left behind. Even in countries where you've seen remarkable progress, inequality can be an undermining sore, an undermining ill that can cripple the progress of the country. You see entities, you see organizations, constituencies that are not participating in the progress, not getting the opportunities for advancement, whether it be inequality of opportunity due to gender, or due to religion, or due to caste, or due to disabilities, or due to sexual orientation. The MDGs have not been able to reach a lot of these constituencies that are not reaping the benefits that we've already seen from meeting MDG number 1, reducing the number of people living in extreme poverty by half. We've met that one, but still a lot of other MDGs have gone unmet, and we have to try to find where these gaps are. And they have to be sustainable. Sustainable environmentally. We can't develop if we deplete the planet's resources for future generations, for your kids, or some of you in the audience. I see young people in the audience. That's great. So we've got to make sure that whatever comes after the MDGs is a path that we can sustain, that will leave our planet whole and useful and green and diverse for future generations. There's also a lot of talk that these next set of goals should be universal, should apply to everybody. Too much of the dynamic in the MDGs was rich countries saying, all right, poor countries, we know what's best for you. Here's what you should do. We now want to make this one more inclusive. We're all in this together. Rich and poor countries, developed and developing. And make sure that we can agree on a common set of aspirational yet attainable goals. So what's your role? It's a very important role. You have to find a way to communicate to leaders the importance of the opportunity in front of us. It's not easy. I do this on a daily basis. Trying to translate UN speak into American up on Capitol Hill is no small task. We speak in a lot of jargon, a lot of acronyms from diverse cultures. So trying to bridge the work of the United Nations to an American audience is something that's incredibly difficult but incredibly important, and something that, again, we rely at the United Nations on you in UNA, across the country to try to accomplish for us. Just on the post-2015 development agenda all by itself, the story almost writes itself for potential critics, doesn't it? You heard me discuss some of the key elements that some parties are hoping to negotiate in whatever succeeds the MDGs. So think about what you might see from, I don't know, your favorite conservative news source. Headline reads, UN cooking up another expensive scheme to take our money and tell us what to do with our lands, our kids, and our internet. Ooh. We've already seen some of this. It's an easy target. It's an easy target. So what you have to do is get up to Capitol Hill and take away the boogeyman. Make sure that folks know that this is not a UN attempt to take over the world or to mandate that huge chunks of US resources go to corrupt third world dictators. This is how I hear this post-2015 agenda described in some quarters. It's an opportunity for the United States to leverage its resources and accomplish more by working in partnership with every other country on the planet to an agreed set of goals, of common goals. That's the approach that we need to take on Capitol Hill. You have to figure out ways to walk potential critics off these hyperbolic ledges before they jump and are convinced that the UN is out to tell the United States what to do. I'll let you in on a secret. I worked for the UN now for 8 years. The UN is never going to tell the United States what to do. I'm sorry for you world government advocates out there. It's just not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. For the United States, for all of its superpoweristic tendencies, there's no way that the United Nations can impose things that will undermine our sovereignty without U.S. support. The Security Council, where the real teeth lies, who's got the veto? U.S. has got the veto, along with 4 others. We could have a long talk about that, but I don't want to get off the subject too much. So talk about how the U.S. can accomplish more towards its goals, towards achieving its interests, by working in partnership with others. Talk about innovation. I like to say that this isn't your father's United Nations anymore. So many Americans only see a United Nations that is, well, what I'm doing. Talk, talk, talk. They see motorcade gridlock in New York during the General Assembly. They see Hugo Chavez, now dearly departed, or others up at the podium criticizing the United States during General Assembly speeches. Well, we have to hear what the world is saying about the United States, but that's not where the real rubber meets the road. The General Assembly is a wonderful entity, but it's not putting peacekeepers on the ground in Central African Republic. It's not changing the mandate of the peacekeeping mission in South Sudan to focus on protection of civilians during that civil war. It's not looking at humanitarian crises or protection of intellectual property rights through our specialized agencies. You know, talking about innovation, I think I can get away with enough of you not having heard this one that I can launch into the airplane story. Those of you can go get coffee that have heard this one before. But when you're talking about the UN of today in an interconnected world, you're talking about a UN that most Americans never see, but nonetheless really do experience on an almost daily basis. So, here comes the airplane story. How many of you have been on a flight from one country to another? I love it. What an internationalist crowd. All right. So you get in this hypothetical airplane out there at Dulles, and you're heading off to Charles de Gaulle Airport outside of Paris. Ooh la la. What guarantee do you have that your pilot is going to speak in the same language at the control tower at Dulles and the control tower at Charles de Gaulle Airport? Ambassador Bliss knows this very well. He can call me out if I screw something up. What guarantee do you have that your runway is going to be long enough in France so that your plane doesn't end up in some French cow field? You can thank the work of the UN's International Civil Aviation Organization that sets standards for civilian air travel amongst our member states. And if you're on this hypothetical flight and you enjoy an in-flight movie, its intellectual property rights and the accompanying technological wonders are guarded by the work of WIPO, the UN's World Intellectual Property Organization. If your flight attendants are relatively happy, it could be because they negotiated a trade agreement or a labor agreement along guidelines promulgated by the UN's International Labor Organization. If you enjoy an in-flight meal, or at least if it doesn't make you sick to your stomach, you can thank the work of the UN's Food and Agricultural Organization that helps set standards for agricultural sector in developing countries. And if once you land overseas, you want to go see a major tourist designation, perhaps it's designated a World Heritage Site by UNESCO, the United Nations Education, Scientific, and Cultural Organization that helps humankind preserve our common heritage. If you're excited about what you've seen, write a postcard, stick a stamp on it, put it in a French mailbox. How's it going to find its way across oceans and national boundaries? The work of the United Nations Universal Postal Union, UPU. Now, you've heard me say this before, some of you. Once my daughter heard me talk about the airplane story at a Model UN. And she came up to me afterwards, as daughters do, and said, "Dad, that is so lame. Nobody sends postcards anymore." And I said, "Aha, bratty teenager. You know that cell phone that is surgically attached to your hand and causing you to have inordinately large thumbs? Every text, every email, every international phone call that you send from one country to another, possible due to the work of the United Nations International Telecommunications Union." Booyah, score one for the older generation. So you get the point. You get the point. In a globalizing world, where so often one country, even a superpower, cannot go it alone, you've got an entity like the United Nations and the specialized agencies that comprise the United Nations helping the gears in a globalizing world turn better. And here's where I often get myself into trouble. This is an American audience, so I'm going to risk it. These guidelines and best practices and standards that the UN specialized agencies are promulgating on a global basis, they're not developed in Bujumbura, Burundi. They look very familiar to Americans. A lot of these practices are things that we've come up with, that the rest of the world can learn from. So just between you and me, a lot of this globalization, particularly through UN specialized agencies, has a uniquely Western character that many of us can be very comfortable with because we figured out ways that things work. Let our folks on Capitol Hill know that, and maybe they'll raise an eyebrow and go, "Oh, I thought the UN was anti-American." Not so, not so. When you're on the Hill, talk about national security. That usually gives people pause. National security in the United Nations? Yup. We've talked already about UN peacekeeping. You're not going to put American boots on the ground in the Central African Republic. You're not going to put American boots on the ground in Mali. But the United States still has abiding interests in these areas. You don't want to see them crumble into failed states that can turn into breeding grounds for terrorists. So UN peacekeeping, despite all its faults, I emphasize again, the UN is not perfect, but despite all its faults, is still the best tool that we have other than sending in the Marines. It has international buy-in, it has international legitimacy, it costs less, it saves money. There was a famous study by the US Government Accountability Office a few years ago saying that UN peacekeeping costs on average 1/8 of sending in a direct US military intervention. Pretty good deal for your tax dollars and for the tax dollars that our representatives are safeguarding up on Capitol Hill. And talk about counterterrorism. Yes, the UN is in the counterterrorism business through the UN Office on Drugs and Crime in Vienna, Austria. Not a bad place to work. Nonetheless, They're working on helping developing countries that have domestic terrorist challenges figure out ways to get at the root causes of those terrorist movements, to train their security forces, to help develop their country's economies so that you drain the swamp, in an overused phrase, to give people opportunities for jobs, for advancement, for education for their kids, so that they don't feel so disenfranchised that they turn to radicalism. So you can talk about counterterrorism. You can talk about counter-narcotics. The United Nations, again, UN Office on Drugs and Crime, does remarkable work coordinating international counter-narcotics efforts. My own United Nations Development Program has done a lot of work with Central American and Caribbean countries, working on what we call citizen security, trying to improve rule of law, professionalizing civilian police, improving the judicial sector, so that the governments can withstand the transshipment of narcotics that moves to their region, more often than not to our country. The UN is playing in all of these fields. And don't just talk to allies. It's wonderful to talk to allies. You want to make sure that they're still up there fighting the good fight. But open a conversation with skeptics. It's hard. I'll tell you, I've got people that I'm related to who still wonder, why do you work for the United Nations? Aren't you some kind of traitor if you work for the United Nations? Then I have to go through what I just went through with you. It takes 45 minutes. They get bored. Anyway, talk to the critics. Let them know that the UN is not out to take over the internet or tell them that they can't own a gun. That's not what the UN is about. The UN is about what we've been talking about this morning and so many other things. But listen to them with respect. Listen to their concerns. Have I mentioned that the UN is not perfect? We live in a highly imperfect world. The UN is 193 countries trying to come together to find agreement. Friday night is pizza night in my house. My wife and my 2 kids can't get the 4 of us to come together on what to put on the darn pizza. Imagine 193 countries from different cultures and different languages trying to agree on global matters of peace, security, and development. It's no small task. The UN is never going to be perfect. But it is a wonderful tool, a wonderful entity that can still accomplish a lot and further U.S. interests. So let the critics, let the skeptics know that this is what the UN of today is, not what they'll see on their TV screens during General Assembly gridlock in September. I'm going to wrap up to leave a few minutes for your questions. But in closing, 2015, right around the corner, yep, it's June already. 2014 is just about half gone. 2015 is going to be the year that we negotiate whatever succeeds the Millennium Development Goals, a global development architecture, maybe some progress on climate change. There'll be another big climate change negotiation coming up in the same time frame. And you might not be aware of it, but there's a big election in 2016 for Secretary General. Oh yeah, there is another election going on, that's right. But our member states will be in the process of selecting a new Secretary General in 2016 as well. So coming up over the next short period are going to be a lot of crucial turning points for the UN system. A lot of times when we're going to need understanding, yes, resources, and U.S. engagement, if not leadership. The U.S. can achieve more by working in partnership with other countries through the United Nations, but the United Nations will fail without U.S. engagement, without U.S. leadership, without U.S. support. That's why your work is so important. That's why what you're undertaking this weekend and tomorrow on Capitol Hill is so vital to the work that we do in the United Nations. And that's why I am eternally grateful for your time, your efforts, your money, and your support. Thank you very much for your attention this morning. Please let me have any questions that you, look at that, I cut off the applause.
Wait for the microphone.
If you got a question, let's see. It looks like there are microphones out there that are making their way around the world. This very dapper gentleman has got one, and we've got our first questioner there. Yes, sir. Let me know your name and where you're from, if you would, too.
Sure. Tino Calabia, and I'm with Karen Mulhouse's home chapter.
Good to see you, Tito.
The question is, tomorrow we're going to be dealing with the federal government on the Hill. But back home for many of the chapters, there are 26 states which have looked at resolutions or bills that are anti-Agenda 21. What we've done back in the state legislatures.
Yep. Yep. That's a tough one because Agenda 21 has got another one of these cryptic UN names. Who out there is familiar with Agenda 21? Have you come across this? You know, my colleagues and me in the United Nations were really slow off the blocks on this one. We thought, Agenda 21, how to usefully use each country's internal resources and natural wildlands, how to preserve diversity. Who could have a problem with that? A lot of people found out that they thought they had problems with that, or decided that it would be a wonderful fundraising tool if they had problems with that. So a lot of the critics really got a fast start on, once again, characterizing this as some type of UN global scheme to take over what we do with our national parks or our natural resources. And that's not the case. Nobody's going to be able to force anybody to do anything under Agenda 21. Full stop. So if there are folks out there that think somehow U.S. national parks or natural resources are at risk, they're not. Look at the language under Agenda 21. Look at the ability that the UN has to enforce whatever it puts out there. Not so much, other than the Security Council. So Agenda 21 is not some type of secret scheme. Urge the folks to sit down, talk with particularly my colleagues at the United Nations Environmental Program. They have a superbly talented team here in Washington. If they've got concerns, if they've got questions, do your best to address them, that this is not some type of big conspiracy. And then if they get into real nuts and bolts, send them our way, and we can walk them through word by word how this is not a threat to the United States. I'm glad you raised it, though. Who else has got a question? Oh, I like it. You guys are bright and awake and ready to go first thing in the morning. Please, all the way in the back.
Hi, I'm Veronica Doolin. I'm from UNA Georgetown at Georgetown University.
Cool. I'm married to a Hoya, so I'm predisposed to like you already.
You mentioned that you think the Millennium Development Goals are changing and that they had sort of a Western influence. I was wondering, what in the future do you think the Millennium Development Goals post-2015 are going to look like, or how do you think they're going to shift?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Like I said, the MDGs in 2000 were kind of like Moses and the Ten Commandments. They came out of a dark conference room in the basement of UN headquarters and were sprung full-blown, from the minds of a few development experts. And a lot of world leaders kind of looked at them and said, well, all right, these sound good, but they had no role in the development and in creating them, much less you all, real people out there with real experience in trying to make their way through the real world. So this time we've really erred on the side of inclusiveness, on getting experiences from as diverse a range of actors as possible, and that has led us to some very interesting conclusions. We've got the My World survey. If you haven't taken it already, I urge you all to go to myworld.org and vote. Some of the findings are dramatic. The things that you would expect to see are up there: health, education, making sure children have a better opportunity. But I think number 3 in the rankings thus far, because it's still an opportunity to get in there and vote, has been a demand by citizens for an honest, transparent, and accountable government. You don't see anything on governance in the Millennium Development Goals. And I touched on the people that have moved out of extreme poverty, but there's still a big chunk that have not. And those are the ones that we have to figure out how to reach in whatever comes after the MDGs. Whether it's because they're in a fragile state, or whether it's because they're part of a constituency that is not being part of an inclusive development effort. So there are holes within the MDGs that are leaving populations behind. And those are going to have to be addressed in whatever comes next. And then the big kicker is that these are also going to be, in many people's minds, universal goals. They're going to apply to you. The UN's going to tell you to turn that light switch off when you leave the room. But otherwise, we're not going to be able to address these issues that are confronting our planet if we don't make this next set of goals sustainable and sustainable by everyone. So thanks for your question. All right, where do we go next? Yes, we had a very patient fellow right in the center.
You sure about that?
I think so.
Gary Shellman, Greater Milwaukee UNA.
Oh, wonderful, thanks.
I would like to just ask you to include another concept in the wonderful way you explain the reasons why the United States should support Kogi. And that's the concept of outsourcing. I think even our senior Senator Ron Johnson would understand that outsourcing our most expensive aspects of foreign policy to the UN might be a very constructive way of convincing him to get over it.
It's a good argument. It's a good argument. There are things that the United Nations can do pretty darn effectively and more cheaply than if the United States decided to shoulder the burden all by itself. I mentioned humanitarian relief. For better or for worse, we don't want this job, but the UN is doing it, and the UN is doing it about as well as humanly possible. Now, if you wanted to devote sending in the U.S. Armed Forces to focus on humanitarian relief, yeah, they can get a lot of stuff done awfully quickly and very well, but at significant cost to taxpayers and at significant distraction from, the other primary mission that I think they're on the planet to do, which is protect our country from threats. So the United Nations has fallen into this role and is doing it well, and if outsourcing tasks like that to the United Nations can pursue U.S. interests, do it more cheaply, and get the job done pretty well, it's a good argument, even for your senator. All right, let's see. Let's go over way in the back. We've got one. Excellent.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
John Bush from Wisconsin Division, so we're represented here.
We got a Wisconsin cabal at work here. Okay, great.
I like what you said about not reaching out to folks who are already identified allies.
Yeah.
And I was thinking back to Members' Day in February in New York and some of the great panels, for example, on global warming and how people from all over the world are making remarkable progress. In contrast to some of the political stagnation here, or that they're advancing all these rights, the different treaties like disability rights and other things, but it's blocked up in the Senate here. And I think inherent to a lot of what you're saying, we have to not be afraid to assert these are American values, these are American ideas. We used to be on the cutting edge of these issues, and we're not anymore because of this narrow way of thinking that links homeschooling to disability rights, which has nothing to do with anything. So we really got to call folks on this and say this is about us being leaders again.
That's a very, very strong argument. And I have to tread carefully. I'm going to rely upon all of you guys not to get me fired. But, you can see I'm an American from a mile away when I'm walking down the hall at UN headquarters, but I am also an international civil servant. I'm not at the UN because I want to help the United States. I'm at the UN because I believe in what it says in the UN Charter, we the peoples. That doesn't mean that it's contrary to U.S. ideals. In fact, it's exactly as you say. So many of these fundamental ideals upon which the UN is founded come from the United States. The U.S. had no small role in creating the United Nations, so this is not an accident. But it's a very powerful argument when you start to think that somehow the UN is slipping away onto a different track or a different path from United States fundamental values. It's not. And if there are actors at the United Nations that are trying to take it on that path, the answer is not to sit back and go, waste of time. The answer is to get in the room and work the votes, to convince the skeptics, to bring along the people on your side. So by all means, I would argue that UN fundamental values and US fundamental values are in pretty close harmony. And when they aren't, well, then that's the day that I will quit the United Nations. But it hasn't happened yet. Thanks. All right, let's see. Have you got one, or are you going to rely on me to pick it? Okay, excellent.
Hi, I'm Eleanor Dwight from Colorado. Your development program, it's hard for development to take place when there are so many wars going on. And wars are certainly taking a lot away. And I'm worried about what will happen if and when these wars end. Is there some kind of a program to come in and fill that vacuum very quickly? Because if we don't, I don't know what will happen.
You're a very smart person, Eleanor. For a long time, the United Nations would see issues of peace and security and humanitarian in one basket, and then development over here in another basket. And what happens, you can just see from the statistics, how many countries where there have been peacekeeping missions that were closed down only to lapse back into conflict, because that infrastructure was just not there to create a viable state or to move forward and consolidate a peace agreement. So what you've seen, particularly in my arm of the United Nations, UNDP, is an effort to bridge those two worlds of peace, security, humanitarian, the crisis, the violence, the security issues, and longer-term development. So we've now got these things called integrated peacekeeping missions, where you've got human rights monitors, gender experts, job creation specialists, rule of law monitors, civilian police advisors, getting right in there with the blue helmets and the guys with the guns to start building the bulwark for what comes next, the foundation for what comes next. You can argue that in South Sudan there was a little bit too much of a rush to try to create a country, and that's why we're seeing some of the violence that has broken out in recent months flare up. So we're still learning our lessons. But a lot of the UN has gotten the lesson, as have our member states, that it's not either or. It's a continuum, moving from a fragile, violence-ridden state to longer-term development, and you've got to have someone bridging this middle area, making sure that these institutions are rising up and in place for people to get jobs, to have their kids in schools, to have an infrastructure to be able to get to health clinics, and to have access to a judicial system that'll take care of their grievances, starting from day one, as soon as a ceasefire is signed. So a very good question. Thank you. All right, back there in the back.
Thank you. Olga Widener from Southern Illinois.
Hi, Olga.
And thank you for your remarks. They're inspiring. Tomorrow morning, we're calling on our senators. Would it be worthwhile to make the case for the U.S. being in a leadership role in advancing international law? Wouldn't that help our treaties to be ratified?
The answer is, of course. The issue up on Capitol Hill is that, you've got a significant amount of gridlock these days. And in fact, in the Senate, where you need to get 60 votes to try to invoke cloture, because inevitably, whatever issue you've got, you're going to have folks that are willing to threaten the filibuster. You have to have an almost supermajority to make things move. What's disheartening is that I think a lot of critics out there are portraying UN treaties or conventions in ways that if you sit down and you read them, they aren't. And when you see something like the UN Treaty on Disabilities go down to defeat, when a senator, former presidential candidate like Bob Dole, is wheeled onto the floor of the Senate in his wheelchair by his wife, former Senator Libby Dole, advocating for this treaty, and it still goes down to defeat, it's disheartening. So you have to go back to the question from the gentleman in the back and remind your folks on Capitol Hill that these treaties and conventions are not somehow anti-American. This Convention on Disabilities is essentially international codification on the Americans with Disabilities Act. Off to just between you and us, invented in the United States. So these treaties and conventions are generally not the threats that sometimes their critics are portraying them to be. And if you get them to sit down and walk through what's of concern to them and what is really written on the paper, hopefully you can see some progress. Over here. Oh, this will be a nice, easy question.
Bill Knott, Southwestern Connecticut. I should add that a few years ago, we were fortunate enough to have Bill come speak to our UN Day program, so I highly recommend him if he's available for your other chapters. But
I do parties and bar mitzvahs also, so you did.
But the question I have is the development question, and this is something I've run into with some of my friends in Connecticut about foreign aid. You know, it's the old thing about we give too much foreign aid to other countries, and it's wasted. It goes into somebody's back pocket, doesn't reach the people in need. And I was wondering now, because of the issue of country execution of programs that used to be done by the UN or UNDP or the UN agencies, now it appears, or at least this was something that people understand is happening, where the UN gives money to the countries directly, then they execute the projects, and that is, some people view that as a recipe for corruption, and it reduces our ability to get the funds we need. I was wondering how we should address that, if that comes up with the Congressman and Senator.
There's a decent chance it will come up with a congressman or senator or their staff, because unfortunately the prevailing impression is that, as our friend Senator Helms said some years ago, foreign aid is money down a rat hole. Maybe at one point that was true. I think it's increasingly difficult to misuse foreign aid spending. First and foremost, it's important to remind members of Congress and their staff that I would say the majority of foreign aid spending is not going overseas. It's actually going into pockets of Americans. U.S. contractors, U.S. goods being shipped overseas. A big chunk of foreign aid is spent back here at home. So that's a strong argument. Second, an argument in favor of increased aid effectiveness and transparency has revolutionized the development landscape. In fact, I'll toot our own horn. UNDP was elected the fourth most transparent aid institution in the world and the most transparent multilateral institution last year by Publish What You Fund. We put every project in every country where we work on a big website called Open UNDP. So everybody knows where this money's going, assuming you can get access to the internet, so that you can hold your leaders accountable. And in fact, we're also seeing this trend for local ownership. So Bill, as you state correctly, we're trying to get away a little bit from flying the American in the suit over to the Capitol to run around for a week to tell everybody what to do, who then flies back and doesn't oversee the program. We're working now with local partners. And if that government is not a trustworthy local partner, we work with NGOs or civil society organizations that we do know are going to use those aid dollars effectively. So this has been a big issue of focus, and I would say impressive gains have been made. All right, where's our microphone? We'll do one more here.
Ellen Reed, Dallas chapter. Just informing us ourselves of facts for tomorrow.
Yeah.
Can you tell me what is the budget for the UN system?
Sure. Let's see. For the UN system, there was a report not too long ago that was actually required by a neighbor of yours, Senator Coburn from Oklahoma, that said the U.S. contribution to the entire UN system was $8 billion. I've never seen a figure for every fund, program, and specialized agency of the UN added up. What I have seen is the UN Secretariat's budget, which is roughly $2 billion for all of this humanitarian assistance coordination for human rights work. I know the peacekeeping budget is now getting in the neighborhood of, I believe, $8 billion a year. So you're talking real money. But again, remember that the United States contribution is usually only about 22 to 25% of that budget. So our dollars are leveraging another 75% on top of our contribution. And the final point I'll make is that big chunks of the UN, like my own beloved UNDP, are entirely voluntarily funded. Nobody has to give us a single penny if we aren't doing something that's in their interest and if we aren't doing it well. So every year we have to re-earn that trust in order to get the voluntary contributions that keep us in business. So I don't have a dollar figure for the entire UN system, but I've got some of those figures with parts that I know better, and the bigger ones will get up into the billions of dollars. So it's a significant chunk of change, but again, the US portion is only a relative minority percentage of that. And we'll take one final one, Karen, and then I'll stick around if anybody's got a question in a coffee break or something. Happy to help. All right, we'll do one more right up front.
Hi, I'm Gabe Levitt, the president of the Brooklyn chapter. Wim is a global civil servant, so his interests are global as part of the mandate of his job. But he is making the point that we need to push the UN as in favor of our national interests when we go to the Hill tomorrow. And I'm wondering, kind of as a comment and then kind of as a question, and I'm sure Jordy will have a lot to say about this later. You know, China's military budget is going through the roof over the next 10 years. Our budget, while still many of us will argue might be too high, that's maybe some of us think it's not too high, but is going down. This idea of soft power and realizing American and other Western, and not just Western, but people who believe in free and fair elections and democracy and human rights, this is a way to combat those parts of the Chinese government that we don't agree with. My members of Congress in New York are obviously not always UN cheerleaders, but they're in favor of what the world body does. Maybe that argument will work with more military-minded senators and members of Congress that we need to fight these battles, and the UN is not the UN of the 1970s with this block of left-wing countries. And I'm not sure how to best articulate that on the Hill, but if Jordy can speak to that, and as you, as much as you're able to speak to that, would be great.
Gabe, you've done a pretty darn good job of it yourself. I think just to add very briefly to that, I was at a roundtable here in Washington just a week or so ago where someone from the White House National Security Council staff was talking about genocide prevention and how even when there may be a country that does not have huge national security implications for the United States, it's still a moral obligation that we as citizens will often put pressure on our governments to intervene in places like Darfur or South Sudan or Central African Republic, that you can't just stand by idly and watch these outrages take place. And he talked about various budgets that they've got in the federal government to try to prevent genocide. And so I stood up and I reminded him, well, development is a pretty darn good antidote to genocide. And it gets to the question from over here as well. Development is not just jobs, which is important, but it's also making sure that there are things like in Pakistan, mobile courts that can get around to areas where traditionally there has not been a lot of rule of law, so that people feel that they've got some recourse to a legal resolution to their concerns and complaints. Development is things like making sure police are professionalized and getting paid regularly so that they don't have to live off bribes or extortion from the people that they're supposed to protect. Development is about open, transparent elections so that people feel like they have a stake in saying who the leaders of their country are. These are the types of things in development or even in national security that can help create stronger countries, help prevent failed states that become breeding grounds for fundamentalism or terrorists, and help, you heard the old phrase, two countries that both have McDonald's in them have never gone to war. Well, when you see countries start to do better, I don't know if that's true, but it sounds good. You see, as countries start to do better, they get more stakes in the global system. They're more likely to try to resolve their disputes peacefully or through other alternative mechanisms. This is where the United Nations can play a big role, and I would say also make a very compelling argument for a lot of the elected representatives on the Hill. All right, I've gone over my time. I did, like I mentioned, I'm happy to stick around and have a chat or answer a question or two afterwards during the break. But thank you for your work, thank you for your attention, and keep doing what you're doing. Thank you very much.